Hello everyone, my name is John Olson and we're going to go on a brief video tour of the history of manners. Enjoy! Now we're going to do a quick commercial. I wrote a book on the history of manners. It's called Where Did You Get Your Manners? And it's available on Amazon. So I hope you might consider purchasing the book. That's my commercial. As we go through the video, we're going to look at the history of manners in several dimensions. We're going to look at intelligent mammals, because they also had their manner manifestations, and then work our way through human history. Well, as we do so, we'll be looking at courting relationships, marriages, divorces, same-sex relationships, table manners, dialogue, attire, and the rules for good behavior. As we look at chimpanzees, check out their courting behavior, holding hands and grooming. And by the way, they had quite a vocabulary.
They have complex emotions, advanced problem-solving skills, and even engage in activities like grooming and playing, just like we do. Chimpanzees are incredibly intelligent tool users. They have been observed using sticks to fish for termites, leaves to soak up drinking water, and even rocks to crack open nuts. It's like watching the early stages of human innovation right in the wild. Now, here's something really touching. For chimpanzees form strong social bonds and live in communities that can range from a few individuals to over 100. They establish close relationships through grooming, which helps to strengthen their social ties and maintain harmony within the group. It's a heartwarming reminder of the importance of connection and care. Communication among chimpanzees is incredibly sophisticated. They use a mix of vocalizations, facial expressions, and body language to convey messages and emotions. From warning calls to playful gestures, their communication is rich and varied, much like our own. Imagine holding a conversation without uttering a single word. Lastly, chimpanzees are crucial to their ecosystems. As they move through the forest, they help to disperse seeds, maintaining the health and diversity of their habitat. In this way, these incredible creatures play a vital role in the environment, and their conservation is essential for the well-being of our planet.
Elephants, too, had their courting behavior. And by the way, they had some same-sex relationships among the males. They had their own vocabulary, and their society, as you will see, was matriarchal.
African elephants live in close-knit family groups known as herds that are typically led by a matriarch, an older, experienced female elephant. The matriarch plays a vital role in guiding the herd and ensuring its survival, making decisions about where to find food and water and how to avoid potential dangers. The bonds among elephants in the herd are strong, and members display a deep sense of empathy and care for one another. They can often be seen comforting each other in times of distress, and they mourn the loss of herd members. Elephants are also known for their sophisticated communication, using a wide range of vocalizations, body language, and even seismic signals to convey messages. Low-frequency rumbles, for example, can travel long distances and are used to communicate with other elephants over large areas.
Ah yes, pigs. They also had their courting behavior, and they had their special forms of vocalization, and they, like the elephants, had their own hierarchy. You can read it for yourself.
Pigs have their own vocal language of oinks, squeals, screams, and grunts. Research has found that the sounds they make convey a wide range of information, such as their emotional, motivational, and physiological states. There are around 20 distinct sounds in pigs' vocal communication that we humans have recognized thus far. They make short grunts when excited, squeal when afraid, and scream when they're hurt. Male pigs sing courting songs to females, and mother pigs can recognize their piglets by sound alone.
We don't know much about early Homo sapiens, but we can look at the cave drawings, some of which are in the video, and see that they dressed in deerskin.
This era, spanning from around 300,000 to 30,000 years ago, was dominated by two prominent species, Neanderthals and the first anatomically modern Homo sapiens. While Neanderthals thrived in Europe and parts of Asia, Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, marking the beginning of our direct lineage. The Middle Paleolithic witnessed fluctuating climates, with glacial periods posing challenges and shaping migration patterns. A significant leap during this era was the development of complex social structures and the potential beginnings of spoken language. Hints of symbolic behavior and art emerged, showcasing a blossoming cognitive and cultural evolution. Communities formed, trade networks developed, and the foundation for our modern societies was laid during these transformative millennia. The tools of this era, like the Mousterian toolset, evolved in sophistication, mirroring the growing complexity of their creators.
Mesopotamia was the first major civilization, and now we get into formal marriages that were arranged and contractual, multiple wives, and divorces.
Picture a world without wheels. Hard to imagine, isn't it? Yet that was the reality until around 3500 BC, when the wheel was invented in Mesopotamia. Before this revolutionary invention, transporting goods, people, even ideas, was an immense challenge. The wheel, however, changed everything. It was a game changer that transformed trade, warfare, and societal structures. Imagine a world where distance was no longer a barrier to exchange. It allowed societies to expand, interact, and evolve at unprecedented rates. The wheel was more than a tool, it was the driving force of progress. Yet progress wasn't just about movement, it was also about memory. Around 100 years later, still in Mesopotamia, a new breakthrough emerged that would forever change how we remember and record our history: the birth of cuneiform writing. This was the first system of its kind, a way to inscribe words and ideas into clay tablets. Suddenly, humans had a way to document everything from business transactions to royal decrees, from poetry to prophecy. Cuneiform was a language of progress, a medium that allowed for the transmission of knowledge and culture across generations. In essence, the wheel and cuneiform writing were inseparable companions in our journey towards civilization. The wheel allowed us to explore and expand our physical world, while cuneiform writing enabled us to preserve and pass on our intellectual and cultural heritage. These two inventions paved the way for complex societies to develop, for empires to rise and fall, for the human story to unfold in all its grandeur and tragedy. The wheel and cuneiform writing were the catalyst that propelled us forward into a new era of human history. They were our first steps towards the world as we know it today, a world of connected societies, shared knowledge, and continuous progress. These two inventions from over 5,000 years ago continue to shape our world in profound ways. They remind us of our shared past and our collective journey towards the future.
Ancient Egypt, again, arranged marriages, common divorces. Interesting was the habit of always eating with your right hand. And even more interesting was the fact that the rules for children were written on the walls of the schools for both the boys and the girls. And whether or not they followed those rules had an impact, they thought, on their afterlives.
The roots of formal education in ancient Egypt can be traced back to the Old Kingdom period, around 2686 to 281 BCE. As society became more intricate, the necessity for a well-educated class to handle administrative and religious responsibilities became crucial. By the Middle Kingdom, education systems were firmly established, evolving further during the New Kingdom era. Education in ancient Egypt was highly esteemed, forming the backbone of its complex administration and cultural legacy. Schools, known as houses of life or Per Ankh, were centers of learning attached to temples and government institutions. These schools not only preserved knowledge, but also nurtured the next generation of scribes, priests, and officials. Scribes were the backbone of ancient Egyptian society, responsible for record-keeping, administration, and communication. Their extensive education included advanced writing, mathematics, and a profound understanding of laws and religious texts. Being a scribe was a prestigious and highly respected profession. Ancient Egypt had a variety of schools, each designed for specific purposes. Prince's School provided the highest education to Pharaoh's sons, royal family members, and children of top officials. Occasionally, bright boys from lower classes were admitted if they showed exceptional promise. Temple schools were focused on religious education, preserving sacred texts and rituals, and training future priests and scribes. Palace schools prepared non-royal boys for administrative roles as scribes and officials. Vocational schools taught trades and crafts through apprenticeships, often with officials training their own sons directly through practical experience. The curriculum was demanding, emphasizing writing in hieroglyphs and hieratic script. Students also studied mathematics, essential for architecture and trade, and learned about science, medicine, and engineering. Teaching methods relied on memorization and repetition. Students spent countless hours practicing on papyrus scrolls and ostraka, pottery fragments used for sketches and informal notes. Younger boys started with wooden tablets, which could be wiped clean instead of papyrus, and used special educational books called kemti. These books introduced children to writing with simple language and vertical columns, making it easier for young students to copy and learn. Practical skills were developed through apprenticeships, where young learners worked under the guidance of experienced masters. In ancient Egypt, education was primarily reserved for boys from wealthy families. Sons of scribes, priests, and officials had the privilege to attend schools. Girls, however, were usually taught domestic skills at home. Some women from noble families were literate and knowledgeable. Their family's status allowed them to learn reading. Writing and ciphering, along with politics, art, and history, were key subjects. Many also learned household and slave management. In ancient Egypt, education began at home. Regardless of status, privilege, or gender, both girls and boys learned extensively from their parents. Parents imparted their beliefs, knowledge, and traditions to their children, aiming to preserve the society's future. Ancient Egyptians believed that knowledge was inseparable from ethics and taught their children the importance of morals and proper behavior. Boys typically began formal schooling between the ages of 5 and 9, with the duration of their studies depending on their future roles. Training to become a scribe could take several years of dedicated learning.
Going on to classical Greece, there were no real formal courting relationships, but there might have been competition among the males. Again, contractual marriages, common divorces, common and expected same-sex relationships, and now the beginning of table manners begins to evolve. Greek, of course, was the language of choice, and men or women of higher social status were addressed by sire or your grace, and intellectual discourse was encouraged. They begin to have their own rules in terms of what's good and what's bad in behavior.
Number 1. Children's expulsion ritual. In Sparta, weak or deformed infants were left to die on Mount Taygetus as part of a brutal practice to ensure only the strongest survived. Number 2. Athens ostracism. Athenians could vote to exile a citizen for 10 years if they believed someone was becoming too powerful, using broken pottery shards called ostraca to cast their votes. Number 3. Secretive Eleusinian Mysteries. The Eleusinian Mysteries were secret religious rites in honor of Demeter and Persephone. Participants swore oaths of secrecy, and the exact rituals remain unknown to this day. Number 4. Theban Sacred Band. The Theban Sacred Band was an elite military unit made up entirely of 150 pairs of male lovers, chosen because it was believed they would fight more fiercely to protect their partners. Number 5. Slavery and democracy. Even in democratic Athens, a large portion of the population were slaves, often captured in wars or born into slavery, working in homes, mines, and fields. Number 6. Socrates' odd behavior. Socrates was known for his strange habits, like walking barefoot in all weather and standing motionless for hours in deep thought, contributing to his reputation as an eccentric philosopher. Number 7. Public nudity as a punishment. In Athens, men convicted of certain crimes were sometimes forced to stand naked in public as a form of humiliation and punishment. Number 8. Athenian female exclusion. Women in Athens were largely excluded from public life, confined to managing the household and rarely participating in social, political, or intellectual activities. Number 9. No lawyers in court. Ancient Greek courts had no lawyers. Individuals had to represent themselves, often delivering lengthy speeches, and cases were decided by large juries of citizens. Number 10. Spartan communal meals. Spartan men were required to eat in communal mess halls, syssitia, until age 60, even after marriage, reinforcing the idea that loyalty to the state came before family. Number 11. Unwanted babies were exposed. If a Greek family did not want a baby, they could leave it exposed in a public place to die or be taken by someone else, a practice that was disturbingly common. Number 12. Poisonous makeup. Greek women used white lead as a cosmetic to lighten their skin, unaware that it was toxic and could lead to serious health issues. Number 13. Herodotus' strange histories. Herodotus, known as the father of history, recorded bizarre tales, such as ants in India that dug for gold and griffins guarding treasures, blending history with legend. Number 14. Surgical innovations. Ancient Greek doctors, like Hippocrates, performed surgeries using crude tools but had surprisingly advanced techniques, such as trepanation, where they drilled holes into the skull to treat head injuries. Number 15. The Athenian Plague. During the Peloponnesian War, Athens was struck by a mysterious plague that killed a third of the population, including the leader Pericles. The exact cause of the plague remains unknown, though some suggest typhus or smallpox.
Moving on to the Roman Empire, again, contractual marriages, common divorces by reversing the dowry, again, common same-sex relationships, and we begin to get into dining etiquette, intellectual conversations, and interesting was the habit of resting on your left elbow on a couch while eating with your right hand. Getting back to eating, one should recline at dinner because only the gods stand erect, and by reclining you honor the gods. Every action should be free of haste or carelessness, and there were other rules as it related to proper behavior.
Roman life. The Romans did not really invent many things to advance their civilization. They took what had already been invented and developed it further. The Roman way of life became well known as Romanitas, everything that had to do with being a citizen of the empire. It was not just an empire, it was a system, a single market, and a union of different lands, sharing a developed way of life. The power of the people. The Greeks created democracy, and the Romans took it further. Democracy meant government by patricians. The ruling class, although plebeians, had often had some influence in elections. Slaves, mostly non-Romans, had no power at all. Roman democracy worked well for a time, but in the end it was misused. It was replaced by the rule of an emperor. The Senate. The Senate was ruled by an elected Senate, a group of patricians who selected 2 consuls each year to act as presidents. These presidents were advised by the Senate. Later, Roman soldiers gained greater power than ordinary people, and consuls became military dictators. After the death of Augustus, Rome was ruled by a succession of emperors who held absolute power. Urban life. The largest cities in the empire were Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, with over 100,000 inhabitants in each. Other Roman cities had 10 to 50,000 inhabitants. Each city was carefully laid out with its official buildings and public squares, baths, stadiums, markets, workshops, storehouses, as well as living quarters for each social class. The Romans were superb builders. They built roads across the countryside and walls around towns for protection. People went to the public baths to wash, relax, and meet friends. There were temples dedicated to gods and goddesses. Businesses done in the Forum, especially the city's marketplace. The countryside. As Roman life developed, farms were bought and reorganized by rich city dwellers or awarded to soldiers as estates. Tenants, peasants, and slaves did the work, growing produce for sale in the cities. Large quantities of food and materials were transported from the farms to Rome and other cities. In addition, the legions required feeding, so the country estates were prepared for large-scale and profitable food production. Wealthy Romans lived in large townhouses. They also had grand villas in the country. Some villas were run as large farms. The owner of his family could enjoy a comfortable house and garden, with a heating system to keep him warm in the winter. Many large farms used slave labor to grow highly profitable crops of grain or olives, or to raise sheep and goats for milk, meat, and hide. Everyday life. Life in Rome was in many ways similar to city life today. High-rise houses, traffic problems, shopping, waste disposal, hustle and bustle were all common features. Rome was also a meeting place for people from all over the empire, and people communicated in common languages, Latin and Greek. It was a money economy and a very complex society with several classes, belief systems, and several different religions.
This begins to sound familiar. In the Ming Dynasty, the marriages were monogamous and arranged, although there were sometimes concubines. Only the husband could initiate a divorce. Now the pendulum swings the other way. Same-sex relationships were considered uncivilized. And the manner of speaking was important, with 5 guidelines. I'll let you read them for yourselves. They had specific rules for behavior as it relates to wives and husbands. The woman must serve her husband and parents-in-law with fidelity, bring up the children with love, attend to chores, be polite, never say more than necessary, and keep a good demeanor. The husband should be patient and modest, not pointing out the shortcomings of others, be forgiving, and not be concerned about poverty, life, death, or change.
The Ming Dynasty was a major dynasty in Chinese history, ruling from 1368 to 1644. Here's an overview of its history. 1. Founding 1368, the Ming Dynasty was established by Zhu Wanjian, who rose from humble beginnings to become a military leader. He led a rebellion against the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty and eventually overthrew it, proclaiming himself the Hongwu Emperor and establishing the Ming Dynasty. 2. Consolidation of power 1368-1402. The early years of the Ming Dynasty were marked by efforts to consolidate power and establish stability. The Hongwu Emperor centralized authority, reformed the bureaucracy, and implemented agricultural policies to promote economic prosperity. 3. Economic and cultural flourishing 15th-16th centuries. During the 15th and 16th centuries, the Ming Dynasty experienced a period of economic and cultural flourishing. Trade and commerce thrived, and China became a major center of international trade through maritime routes. The Ming Dynasty also saw the construction of iconic landmarks such as the Forbidden City in Beijing and the restoration of the Great Wall of China. 4. Maritime exploration. One of the most notable achievements of the Ming Dynasty was the maritime exploration led by Admiral Zheng He. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He embarked on several voyages to Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa, showcasing Chinese power and establishing diplomatic relations with other countries. 5. Decline and internal struggles 16th-17th centuries. Despite its early successes, the Ming Dynasty began to decline in the 16th century due to a combination of internal strife, political corruption, and external threats. The dynasty faced challenges such as peasant uprisings, fiscal problems, and invasions by the Mongols and other nomadic tribes. 6. Manchu conquest and end of the dynasty's 17th century. The Ming Dynasty came to an end in 1644 when Beijing was captured by rebel forces led by Li Ziqing. The last Ming Emperor, Chongjin, committed suicide as the rebels entered the capital. Following the fall of Beijing, the Manchu people from the northeast invaded China and established the Qing Dynasty, marking the end of Ming rule. Despite its eventual decline, the Ming Dynasty left a lasting legacy on Chinese history and culture. Its achievements in art, literature, architecture, and technology continue to influence Chinese society to this day.
The Middle Ages. This is interesting. There was no marriage contract. You just said "I do," and that was sufficient. Divorce was not an option, and marriages were not valid if you were not Christian. If you had a same-sex relationship, it was considered sodomy. And look at the large set of table manners. Isn't that interesting? They're all documented in the Book of Courtesy. English and Latin were spoken, and there were specific protocols for addressing people of higher rank. And, again, manners were governed by the rules as dictated in the Book of Courtesy.
First thing, historical people were a lot smarter than we tend to give them credit for. So many of the weird things we hear about, like only drinking beer or ale instead of water, actually make perfect sense when you consider what those historical people had to work with. And when it came to washing things, any things, what medieval people had to work with was questionably sanitary water, ammonia, and lye. Those already don't sound like things you want in your hair, and you're about to want them in your hair even less. Many of the available water sources, wells, ponds, streams, rivers, were not reliably clean, and people got sick after drinking from them. They knew that water carried disease, and in the absence of modern water treatment, they just tried to keep it off their bodies unless they were sure it was safe, or they were washing off something that they knew would definitely make them sick, like London sewage workers swimming in the Thames at the end of the day. Medieval soap, for those that could get it, was too harsh and strong to be used for cleaning human beings. It was pretty much only for washing clothes. Laundresses often had what we nowadays call contact dermatitis because the soap made their hands so rough and red. And for those that couldn't get soap, which was a lot of people since soap cost money, you did your laundry with a combination of lye from wood ash and ammonia from stale human urine. Alright, so washing with soap or soap alternatives is right out.
During Italian Renaissance, marriages were monogamous and contractual, with strict rules and rare divorces. Same-sex relationships, surprisingly, were common and expected. And if you look at the dining behavior in the upper class, we begin to introduce new utensils for eating.
Today, we are going to specifically look at the hierarchical society that existed during the Italian Renaissance. First, I am going to explain the fashion, diet, and social roles of the noble class. Fashion. Fashion was a very important part of the nobles' daily life because it was expected of them to follow the new trends set around the world and use fashion as a political statement. Italian nobles were well versed with the fashion around the world, so most modeled what they wore from trends from other places such as France, Germany, Spain, and Turkey. On a day-to-day basis, the men wore dark colors as a sign of dignity. Young men dressed in tights that were fastened by a quilted doublet covering the torso, and an undershirt called a camicia under the doublet. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the men covered up with tunics made with fine fabric. Older men wore belted or unbelted robes with cloaks. The women at court had a lot of variety with their daily life outfits. Each woman wore a knee or ankle-length white camicia, along with 1 or 2 layers of gowns depending on wealth. Fabric-covered shoes were then placed over silk stockings, and a cloak was added over the whole outfit. The women also played around with different hairstyles, such as the classic horn style, and wore many accessories, which included gloves made out of soft leather, silk, linen, or fish skin, along with handkerchiefs, fans, silk purses, or belts. Diet. Now, I am going to explain the diet of the nobles. Like most things, diets were also different between the social classes during the Italian Renaissance. Foods including fresh meat, spices, fruits, and olive oil were obtained by the nobility. Meat was divided into 2 categories: wild meat, consisting of boar, deer, hare, porcupine, and hedgehog, and domesticated meat, consisting of beef, pork, mutton, goat, and rabbit. Altogether, meat was usually a sign of wealth and mainly reserved for the wealthy. Different spice blends were also considered to be for the wealthy because blending spices required cooks or apothecaries with the knowledge of the 4-step hotness grading scale. There were sweet blends involving bay leaf, cinnamon flowers, ginger, and 1/4 part cloves, and strong blends involving 1/8 part cloves, pepper, nutmeg, and black pepper. Nobility also had very hot spices such as spikenard, long pepper, and mace. Fruits were a luxury as well, so it was mostly offered to the wealthy class. Fruits in Florence consisted of figs, peaches, plums, cherries, apples, pears, pomegranates, and grapes. Due to the magnitude of grapes, most people drank wine with their meals. The nobility's food was cooked different than other social classes because there were more resources to be used. For example, most of the meats were cooked in olive oil, and the bread was made of wheat, making the bread soft and white. Social roles. Lastly, we are going to look at the social roles of the noble class. The social class plays a very important role when looking at social roles and jobs. The social class determined what kind of resources one had. Therefore, the nobility would have access to estates and powerful people. Nobles would also have more leisure time to focus on the arts and music. Noblemen often managed their properties with the help of their hired managers. So, they mainly watched over those running their property and made sure everything was done the way they wanted it. This allowed the nobility to maintain a dominant position. Many nobles also knew many powerful people that could help supply them positions such as governing, advising royalty, and leading militaries. This was considered work for the nobles because they were raised to perform these types of duties rather than actual physical labor. Nobles did not have to worry about financial issues, therefore they had plenty of leisure time to enjoy reading works, painting, listening, or learning to make music. For example, Lorenzo de' Medici enjoyed commissioning major works and employed many artists, including Botticelli. Lorenzo de' Medici was a statesperson and a well-known patron for Renaissance works.
Some people often think that the Victorian era was the height of good manners. That may be true. The engagement process was important, marriages were contractual and arranged in the upper classes, and divorces were uncommon. Same-sex relationships were okay for women and not for men. You were ostracized if you didn't have good table manners, such as using your fingers instead of utensils, talking with a full mouth, and making loud noises while eating. Interesting. Moving on to dressing. Dressing improperly for the occasion or not adhering to the appropriate dress code was seen as disrespectful. It was essential to dress modestly as dictated by societal expectations, and there were specific protocols for greeting one another. I'll let you read them.
Did you know the Victorian society had very strict etiquette rules and ways that the upper class should behave? For example, when attempting to court a lady, Victorian men have to follow the etiquette of not approaching unless given permission and introduced by a mutual acquaintance first. Also, Victorian women could only raise the hem of their dress with one hand when stepping onto the pavement. Lifting a gown on both sides was seen as scandalous. Whenever a Victorian visited another person's home, they were expected to leave their cards upon departure. These were called calling cards. And another thing the Victorian women were not permitted to do was walk alone, without a servant or chaperone to accompany them. When Victorians were dining formally, they would never pass their plate with a knife and fork on it. They should remove them and allow them to rest on a piece of bread.
During the Industrial Age, we introduced mail-order brides, personal ads, and divorces became fault-based and a stigma for women. Same-sex relationships were common in urban settings, and the Book of Modern Manners dictated good table manners, as well as the proper speech and social behavior.
When we first thought about the social life of the factory, we thought about the factory as a social institution, really, and we wanted to focus it on a particular firm, the Leicester firm of Cora, through the 20th century. Now, factories, I think, first and foremost, were places of production, and a lot of the materials that you can see here are architectural drawings and photographs of technology processes, which tell us a lot about the nature of work and how work was organized. But the workforce was organized as well by age, gender, ethnicity. So you'll find in some rooms, for example, you can see that women more or less alone or sometimes under male supervision were working, and that can prompt questions about how hierarchies might have worked within the factory and how they might have been reproduced there. The social life of the factory also implies a life of sociability and leisure as well, and we got some very interesting material here on works outings, on sports days, on Christmas festivities in the firm, a lot of which were captured in the House magazine, the Cora Journal. One of the things that I think is often surprising, and that certainly seems to have caught people unawares at the time, was the sudden ending of firms, and Cora was no different. Its House magazine ends very suddenly in the 1980s. So the social life of the factory tells us about what it was like to work in a social institution like that in the 20th century, and it also tells us about historical processes, work processes, about how work itself got under the skin of life.
Now, in the 21st century, we have our dating apps, monogamous marriages with prenups, and divorces are more common and no longer fault-based. Same-sex relationships are becoming more common and accepted, and we have, of course, our usual set of table manners. Yes, the digital dialogue. A lot has been written about what's proper and what's not proper. And there is a document called Digital Do's and Don'ts, which is worth reading. Attire, one dressed for the occasion, and it was always better to be overdressed than underdressed.
As technology becomes larger and larger part of our day-to-day lives, it has become easy to fall into some bad habits. In a later video, I'm going to talk about how these habits can cause problems in our interpersonal relationships, but today I wanted to focus on how we misuse technology in our professional lives. Let's start by talking a little about norms. As we grow up, we naturally observe the way those around us interact with each other. Behaviors that fall within social practice of acceptability become reinforced and normalized. Behaviors that violate these expectations tend to be punished or discouraged. Think about when you were a kid and a parent scolded you for loudly slurping your food at the dinner table. These types of social norms are informal understandings that govern the behavior of members of a society. Norms are regarded as collective representations of acceptable group conduct, as well as individual perceptions of particular group conduct. They can be viewed as cultural products, including values, customs, and traditions, which represent individuals' basic knowledge of what others do and think that they should do. It is important to note that social norms vary wildly. My aforementioned example of a parent disciplining a child for slurping soup is built on a politeness norm typically observed in the United States and some other countries. However, in Korea, Vietnam, China, and many other countries, slurping is not considered a rude behavior. In fact, in Japan, slurping can be considered a sign of appreciation. The key takeaway is that individual cultures and groups over time will form expectations of what is socially acceptable and what is not. Further, these things are always evolving and thus are always in flux. That brings us back to mediated communication. Much like any group of people, the collection of human beings that make up communities in cyberspace also form their own cultures. Historically, this has led to some issues. In face-to-face settings, we tend to engage in practices of politeness and face saving. Interpersonally, practicing these norms helps us effectively maintain the relationships and avoid embarrassment and generally come across as what we consider polite. Things sometimes change when we add a mediated channel to the equation. Mediated methods of communicating add a certain amount of technological distance and noise to the communicative interaction. Also, when it comes to simpler channels of mediated communication, like chat or other text-based interaction, there is a significant reduction, if not full elimination, of nonverbal cues. In the early days of Usenet and CompuServe, which were an early group discussion systems, users noticed that oftentimes all civility would break down and lead to online fights and conflicts. If you've spent much time reading through the comments on YouTube videos or on political Facebook posts, you may notice that this is a phenomenon that continues today. In 1995, Virginia Shea attempted to standardize internet etiquette in her book, Netiquette. Shea had spent a great amount of time studying various online communities. She noticed that some communities had developed strategies to limit infighting and avoid communicative breakdowns that occurred in some groups. Out of her research came her 10 rules for communicating ethically in the mediated age. Let's look at them and how they are still relevant today. Rule number 1, remember the human. When you find yourself communicating across mediated channels, remember that you are interacting with actual people. Follow the classic rule of treating other people the same way you wish to be treated. That goes a long way towards preserving civility and decorum. Rule number 2, adhere to the same standards of behavior online that you follow in real life. It is easy to feel insulated on the internet. This has led to situations where folks who would never even contemplate insulting a person in a face-to-face interaction have gone as far to incite violence against others. A somewhat dangerous and recent trend amongst online gamers is called swatting. This illegal tactic involved disgruntled players calling the police on an online opponent in hopes that they will disrupt their gameplay or punish them after the fact. In 2017, an incident of swatting led Wichita police to fatally shoot a gamer in Kansas. While this is obviously an extreme example, it is important to remember that ethical behavior is just as important online as it is face-to-face, and breaking the law is just as problematic via mediated channels as it is in other aspects of our lives.